Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet wander through the pages of history. Tonight we'll be exploring a forgotten chapter of ancient life, one that still echoes softly through time. Whether you're settling in with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice keep you company tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time of day is it for you? Are you hearing this as the sun rises, or are you like me, surrounded by the hush of nighttime? If the idea of gentle stories from long ago helps ease your mind, I'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe. There are many more journeys waiting for us just beyond the veil of sleep. But first, let me give you some context about just how devastating losing your clan really was, because the answer will completely change how you think about Viking culture forever. See, when we think about Vikings today, we imagine fierce warriors sailing across treacherous seas, conquering new lands, and living by their own rules. But the reality was far more complex and infinitely more cruel. Viking society wasn't built on individual strength or personal freedom. It was built on something much more fundamental, the clan system. And if you weren't part of that system, you might as well have been dead already. Picture this. You're a young Viking warrior who's just returned from a successful raid in England. Your pockets are heavy with silver, your reputation is growing, and you're looking forward to celebrating with your clan brothers. But when you arrive at your settlement, you find nothing but charred ruins. Your clan has been wiped out by rivals while you were away. Your family is dead, your chieftain is dead, your entire social structure has vanished overnight. Now what? Where do you go? Who protects you? Who vouches for your honor? Who gives you legal standing in disputes? The answer is nobody, because in Viking society, you literally didn't exist without a clan to define you. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a temporary setback. This was social annihilation. Without a clan, you had no legal rights, no protection under the law, and no way to participate in the complex web of obligations and loyalties that held Viking society together. You became what the Vikings called a nid, a person without honor, without standing, without worth. But it gets worse. Much worse. Because losing your clan didn't just mean losing your social status. It meant losing your very identity as a human being in the eyes of everyone around you. Viking culture was so deeply rooted in kinship bonds that they literally couldn't conceive of a person existing independently of their family group. If you had no clan, you had no ancestors to honor, no descendants to protect, and no place in the great chain of being that connected the living world to the realm of the gods. Think about that for a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that not only had you lost your job, your home, and your family, but that society itself no longer recognized you as a legitimate person. That every door you knocked on would be slammed in your face. That every conversation you tried to start would end with people literally turning their backs on you. That's what it meant to be clanless in Viking society. And here's the thing that makes this even more terrifying. It could happen to anyone, at any time, for reasons completely beyond their control. Wars between clans could wipe out entire family lines in a single battle. Diseases could ravage settlements, leaving only scattered survivors with no way to maintain their clan structure. Natural disasters could force mass migrations that split families apart forever. Even something as simple as being born to parents from different feuding clans could leave you in social limbo, belonging fully to neither group. The Vikings had a word for this kind of fate, önd, which roughly translates to the breath of life leaving the body while the body still lives. Because that's exactly what happened to clanless Vikings. They became walking ghosts, technically alive, but socially dead, existing in a twilight world between the living and the truly departed. Now, you might be thinking, surely there were exceptions, right? Surely some clanless Vikings managed to find acceptance somewhere, somehow. Well, there were a few paths available, but each one came with its own terrible price. And that's where this story gets really interesting. because the lengths that clanless Vikings went to in order to survive reveal just how desperate their situation really was. Some tried to join other clans through marriage, but this was incredibly difficult because most clans were extremely suspicious of outsiders, especially ones with no family history to vouch for them. Who was this person really? What had they done to lose their original clan? Were they cursed by the gods? Were they carrying some blood debt that would bring disaster to anyone who helped them? These weren't unreasonable questions in a society where family honor could be stained for generations by the actions of a single member. Others attempted to prove their worth through extraordinary acts of bravery or skill, hoping to earn adoption into a new clan. But this was a double-edged sword, because drawing attention to yourself as a clanless person often backfired spectacularly. Instead of admiration, you might find yourself accused of trying to rise above your proper station, of showing arrogance unbefitting someone with no legitimate social standing. Then there were those who simply tried to disappear, to fade into the background of Viking society, and hope that nobody looked too closely at their lack of family connections. They became the invisible people, the ones who worked the most dangerous jobs, who lived in the worst conditions, who accepted whatever scraps of life they could find without complaint. But even this strategy was fraught with peril because Viking communities were small and tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone else's business, and secrets had a way of coming to light at the worst possible moments. But perhaps the most tragic path was taken by those who chose to embrace their status as outcasts completely. These were the Vikings who became berserkers, the legendary warriors who fought with such savage fury that they seemed possessed by animal spirits. Popular culture portrays berserkers as elite warriors chosen for their exceptional skill, but the historical reality was often much darker. Many berserkers were clanless Vikings who had literally nothing left to lose. They threw themselves into battle with suicidal intensity, not because they were fearless, but because death in combat was preferable to the slow torture of social extinction. The berserker cults that formed around these desperate warriors became a kind of alternative clan structure for the most desperate outcasts. But joining them meant abandoning any hope of normal human relationships, of building a family, of growing old surrounded by loved ones. Berserkers lived short, violent lives on the absolute margins of society, feared and avoided by the very people they sometimes fought to protect. And here's something that will make your blood run cold. The Vikings believed that clanless people were literally contagious, not in the medical sense, but in a spiritual sense. They thought that the bad luck, the dishonor, the divine displeasure that had caused someone to lose their clan could spread to anyone who showed them kindness. This belief was so strong that there are recorded cases of clanless Vikings being driven away from settlements at spear point, not because they had done anything wrong, but simply because their presence was considered dangerous to the spiritual health of the community. Imagine being so thoroughly rejected by society that people believed your very existence could bring down the wrath of the gods on anyone who helped you. Imagine being treated like a walking plague, avoided and feared not for what you had done, but simply for what you had become through circumstances beyond your control. This is where the true horror of being a clanless Viking becomes clear. It wasn't just that you lost your social support network. It wasn't just that you became poor, or homeless, or vulnerable to attack. You became something that other people believed was fundamentally wrong with the natural order of the universe. You became a living violation of everything that Viking society held sacred about family, honor, and the proper relationship between humans and the divine world. The psychological impact of this kind of total social rejection was devastating in ways that are hard for modern people to fully comprehend. We live in individualistic societies where personal identity exists somewhat independently of family connections. But for Vikings, the clan wasn't just important, it was the foundation of selfhood itself. Without a clan, you didn't just lose your place in society, you lost your sense of who you were as a person. This led to what we might recognize today as severe depression, anxiety, and identity crisis. But the Vikings understood it in spiritual terms. They believed that clanless people had lost their connection to their ancestral spirits, the powerful ghosts of dead family members who were supposed to guide and protect the living. Without this spiritual protection, clanless Vikings were thought to be vulnerable to possession by malevolent spirits, to madness, to becoming something less than human. And you know what the most twisted part of all this was? Sometimes they were right. The combination of extreme social stress, constant fear, malnutrition, and psychological trauma did drive some clanless Vikings to behaviors that seemed to confirm society's worst suspicions about them. They became thieves, murderers, practitioners of forbidden magic, or simply went insane from the pressure of trying to survive in a world that had no place for them. This created a vicious cycle where the few clanless Vikings who did manage to survive often ended up doing things that made them genuinely dangerous to be around, which reinforced society's belief that clanless people were inherently corrupted and should be avoided at all costs. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy that trapped these unfortunate souls in an ever-tightening spiral of desperation and degradation. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn, because not all clanless Vikings simply accepted their fate and faded away into obscurity or madness. Some of them found ways not just to survive, but to thrive in ways that fundamentally challenged the very foundations of Viking society. These were the ones who discovered that being an outcast, while terrible, also came with a strange kind of freedom that ordinary Vikings could never experience when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. You discover possibilities that people with everything to protect would never dare explore. And that's exactly what happened to some of the most remarkable clanless Vikings in history. These weren't the broken, desperate souls we just talked about. These were individuals who looked at their complete social annihilation and said, "Fine, if I can't play by your rules, I'll create my own." Think about it. If you're already considered dead to society, what's the worst that could happen? You can't lose your reputation because you don't have one. You can't bring shame on your family because you don't have a family. You can't violate social expectations because nobody expects anything from you in the first place. This terrifying freedom became the foundation for some of the most audacious survival stories in Viking history. Take the case of traders who operated completely outside the normal clan-based merchant networks. Regular Viking traders relied on family connections to establish trust, to guarantee the quality of their goods, and to ensure that debts would be honored. But clanless traders had to find entirely different ways to build credibility. Some became so obsessed with honest dealing that their word became more valuable than blood oaths from established clans. Others specialized in goods that were so rare or dangerous to obtain that their very possession proved their capabilities beyond any doubt. These outcast merchants often ended up traveling farther and taking greater risks than their clan-protected counterparts ever would. They sailed to distant lands that established traders considered too dangerous or unprofitable. They dealt with peoples that respectable Vikings wouldn't touch. They traded in goods that proper clan members wouldn't soil their hands with. And sometimes, just sometimes, they struck it rich beyond imagination. But here's the fascinating part. Even when clanless traders became wealthy beyond the dreams of ordinary Vikings, they often remained outsiders. Money couldn't buy them back into the clan system that had rejected them. Their success sometimes made them even more threatening to established society, because they proved that the clan system wasn't actually necessary for survival or prosperity. They became living contradictions to everything Viking culture claimed to believe about the natural order of things. Some of these successful outcasts tried to use their wealth to force their way back into respectable society. They would offer enormous bride prices to marry into established clans, or they would attempt to buy their way into chieftain positions through lavish gift-giving. But these efforts usually backfired spectacularly. The clans would take their money and then find excuses to reject them anyway, leaving them poorer but no more accepted than before. Others learned to embrace their outsider status completely. They built their own alternative communities, networks of fellow outcasts, who created new kinds of social bonds based on shared experience rather than blood relationships. These groups developed their own codes of honor, their own traditions, their own ways of determining status and respect. They became parallel societies that existed alongside, but completely separate from traditional Viking culture. These alternative communities were often centered around specific skills or activities that mainstream Viking society needed but didn't want to acknowledge. Some became groups of specialized craftsmen who could work with materials or techniques that were considered taboo by respectable clans. Others formed bands of mercenaries who would take on jobs that honorable warriors wouldn't touch. Still others became communities of healers, traders, or even entertainers who served functions that Viking society required but preferred to keep at arm's length. The most successful of these alternative communities developed something that was almost unthinkable in traditional Viking culture. They became truly meritocratic. Without the inherited status and predetermined roles that defined clan-based society, these groups had to judge people based purely on their abilities and contributions. This created environments where talent could flourish regardless of background, where innovation was rewarded rather than discouraged, and where individuals could reinvent themselves completely. But don't think for a moment that this was some kind of progressive paradise. These communities were born from desperation and held together by the shared understanding that failure meant death or worse. The bonds between members were often stronger than traditional family ties, precisely because they were chosen rather than inherited. But they were also more fragile because they weren't backed by centuries of social tradition and legal protection. The psychological transformation required to survive as a clanless Viking was profound and often permanent. People who had been raised from birth to think of themselves as part of an extended family unit suddenly had to develop entirely new concepts of identity and self-worth. They had to learn to trust their own judgment rather than relying on clan elders for guidance. They had to become comfortable with moral and social ambiguity in ways that would have been unthinkable for properly raised Vikings. This process of psychological reconstruction often produced individuals who were simultaneously more vulnerable and more resilient than ordinary Vikings. More vulnerable because they lacked the deep support networks that sustained people through difficult times. More resilient because they had already survived the worst thing that Viking society could do to a person and discovered that life could continue even after social death. Some clanless Vikings became almost supernaturally adaptable, able to blend into any environment, speak any language, understand any culture they encountered. They developed skills in reading people, in detecting deception, in surviving on their wits that far exceeded what most clan-protected Vikings ever needed to learn. They became human chameleons, capable of becoming whatever they needed to be in order to survive another day. But this adaptability came at a terrible cost. Many clanless Vikings lost any stable sense of who they really were underneath all the masks they wore. They became so good at pretending to be different people in different situations that they forgot which version of themselves was authentic. This identity fragmentation was one of the hidden tragedies of clanless life, a form of psychological damage that could persist even if someone eventually found acceptance in a new community. The spiritual implications of being clanless were equally complex and devastating. Vikings believed that the dead members of your clan continued to watch over and guide the living. Ancestor worship wasn't just a religious practice. It was a practical source of wisdom and protection. Clanless Vikings lost access to this spiritual inheritance, leaving them feeling cosmically alone in ways that went far beyond mere social isolation. Some clanless Vikings tried to compensate by developing intensely personal relationships with individual gods or spirits. They became religious seekers in ways that were unusual for mainstream Viking culture, which was typically more communal and ritualistic in its approach to the divine. These personal spiritual practices sometimes led to genuine mystical experiences, but they also sometimes led to delusions, obsessions, and behaviors that confirmed society's suspicions about the spiritual dangers of being clanless. Others rejected Viking spirituality entirely and became remarkably open to foreign religious ideas. Some of the earliest Viking converts to Christianity were clanless individuals who were attracted to a religion that promised universal brotherhood and individual salvation, regardless of family background. This religious conversion sometimes provided a path back into social acceptance, but it also required abandoning the cultural identity that had defined them since birth. The economic strategies that clanless Vikings developed to survive were often ingenious and sometimes revolutionary. Without access to the traditional clan-based systems of mutual aid and resource sharing, they had to become incredibly efficient and innovative in their approach to making a living. Some became pioneers in developing new technologies or techniques because they couldn't rely on inherited knowledge and established methods. Others discovered economic niches that established clans had overlooked or considered beneath their dignity. They became experts in salvaging shipwrecks, in trading with outlaw communities, in providing services that respectable people needed but didn't want to be publicly associated with. These economic activities often put them in contact with the absolute margins of society: escaped slaves, foreign refugees, criminals, and other outcasts who existed outside the normal structures of Viking civilization. These interactions with other marginalized groups sometimes led to the formation of genuinely multicultural communities that were unlike anything else in the Viking world. Groups of clanless Vikings, foreign slaves who had escaped or been freed, traders from distant lands, religious outcasts, and political refugees would sometimes band together to create settlements that operated according to entirely different principles than traditional Viking society. These communities developed their own languages, combining elements from various cultures. They created new forms of art and music that blended different traditions. They developed innovative approaches to everything from agriculture to warfare that drew on the diverse experiences of their members. In many ways, these outcast communities were centuries ahead of their time in terms of cultural integration and social innovation, but they were also incredibly precarious. Without the protection of established clans or recognized legal status, these communities were vulnerable to attack, exploitation, and destruction by more powerful groups. Many of them flourished for a few years or decades before being wiped out by raids, natural disasters, or political changes that left them without allies or protection. The children born into these alternative communities faced unique challenges that were different from, but equally difficult, as those faced by their clanless parents. They grew up with skills and perspectives that were unusual for their time, but they also grew up without clear cultural identities or obvious places in the broader world. Some thrived in this environment of cultural mixing and individual freedom. Others struggled with the ambiguity and uncertainty that defined their lives from birth. Now, you might be wondering about the women in all of this. How did losing clan status affect Viking women differently than men? The answer is both better and worse than you might expect. In some ways, clanless women faced even greater dangers than clanless men. Without the protection of male relatives, they were vulnerable to sexual violence, forced marriage, and exploitation in ways that were truly horrific. But in other ways, clanless women sometimes found opportunities that would have been impossible within traditional clan structures. Some became independent traders, healers, or craft specialists who operated outside the normal restrictions placed on women in Viking society. Others found that their desperate circumstances forced them to develop skills and independence that made them more capable and self-reliant than many of their clan-protected sisters. The most successful clanless women often became masters of negotiation and diplomacy, skills that were essential for survival without male protection, but were rarely developed by women within traditional clan structures. They learned to read people, to build alliances, to manipulate situations to their advantage in ways that were sophisticated and effective. Some of these women became power brokers in their own right, operating behind the scenes to influence events and protect the communities they had helped to create. But again, these successes came at enormous personal cost. The psychological and emotional toll of constant vigilance, of never being able to fully trust or relax, of always having to be on in social situations, was exhausting and often led to early death from stress-related illnesses, even when external threats were successfully navigated. The stories of these remarkable women lead us to one of the most shocking aspects of clanless life that historians rarely discuss: the underground networks that developed to help outcasts survive. You see, while mainstream Viking society officially shunned the clanless, there were always individuals who couldn't stomach the cruelty of complete abandonment. These secret helpers created what we might recognize today as an early form of underground railroad for social outcasts. These networks operated in the shadows, connecting clanless Vikings with resources, information, and temporary shelter. A blacksmith might leave tools outside his workshop at night. A farmer's wife might accidentally leave food where hungry outcasts could find it. Ship captains might allow stowaways to remain hidden during voyages to distant lands where their lack of clan status wouldn't be known. But participating in these networks was incredibly dangerous for the helpers. If discovered, they risked bringing shame and divine displeasure upon their own clans. Some families were torn apart when members were caught helping the clanless, leading to bitter feuds that could last for generations. The moral conflict between human compassion and social obligation created deep psychological wounds in Viking communities that are rarely acknowledged in historical accounts. The most organized of these networks developed sophisticated communication systems using runes carved in specific patterns on trees, rocks, and buildings. These messages could indicate safe houses, warn of dangers, or provide information about opportunities for work or shelter. Learning to read these hidden messages became a survival skill that separated the clanless Vikings who thrived from those who simply endured. Some of the most successful network operators were people who existed on the edges of respectability themselves: widows without male relatives, younger sons with no inheritance prospects, or individuals whose clans had been weakened by recent conflicts. These people understood vulnerability in ways that fully protected clan members never could, and their empathy drove them to take enormous risks to help others. The networks also served as information exchanges, where clanless Vikings could learn about opportunities in distant lands. They discovered which foreign rulers were hiring mercenaries, which trading routes needed protection, which new settlements were welcoming skilled workers, regardless of their background. This information flow sometimes gave clanless Vikings advantages that their clan-bound counterparts lacked, because established families were often reluctant to risk their status by venturing into unknown territories. But here's where the story gets truly extraordinary. Some clanless Vikings didn't just survive, or even thrive individually. They actually began to change Viking society itself from the outside. Their innovations in trade, warfare, technology, and social organization slowly influenced mainstream culture in ways that most people never recognized. Take maritime technology, for example. Clanless Vikings, who became sailors out of desperation, often had to make do with inferior vessels and equipment. This forced them to develop innovations that made their ships faster, more maneuverable, or more seaworthy than traditional designs. When these improvements proved successful, they were gradually adopted by established clans who never acknowledged where the ideas had come from. The same pattern emerged in warfare. Clanless warriors who couldn't afford traditional weapons and armor had to develop new fighting techniques that maximized effectiveness while minimizing cost. They pioneered the use of improvised weapons, unconventional tactics, and psychological warfare methods that eventually influenced Viking military culture as a whole. In trade, clanless merchants who couldn't rely on family connections had to develop new methods for establishing trust and conducting business across cultural boundaries. They became experts in foreign languages, customs, and negotiation techniques that proved invaluable as Viking expansion brought them into contact with increasingly diverse populations. Perhaps most importantly, the alternative communities created by clanless Vikings began to demonstrate that social organization didn't have to be based entirely on blood relationships. These experiments in meritocratic governance, voluntary association, and multicultural cooperation planted seeds that would eventually contribute to the evolution of Viking society toward more flexible and inclusive structures. The psychological innovations were equally significant. Clanless Vikings developed concepts of individual identity, personal responsibility, and self-determination that were revolutionary for their time. They had to learn to make decisions without consulting clan elders, to take responsibility for their actions without the buffer of family protection, and to create meaning in their lives without the traditional framework of ancestral honor and inherited purpose. These psychological developments sometimes produced individuals of extraordinary capability and vision. Freed from the constraints of traditional thinking, some clanless Vikings became innovators, philosophers, and leaders who saw possibilities that more conventional minds couldn't imagine. Their outsider perspective allowed them to identify problems and solutions that were invisible to people embedded within the system. But the price of this innovation was often madness or death. The human mind wasn't designed to operate without social support, and the stress of constant reinvention took a terrible toll. For every clanless Viking who became a visionary leader, there were dozens who broke under the pressure and became cautionary tales about the dangers of abandoning traditional ways. The relationship between clanless Vikings and the supernatural world was particularly complex and fascinating. Cut off from traditional spiritual practices, many developed highly personal and often unorthodox religious beliefs. Some became convinced that their suffering was a test imposed by the gods, and that surviving it would grant them special powers or divine favor. Others concluded that the gods had abandoned them entirely and turned to darker spiritual practices. They sought power from entities that respectable Vikings wouldn't dare approach: land spirits, sea monsters, the ghosts of enemies, and foreign deities who demanded terrible prices for their assistance. These spiritual experiments sometimes granted them abilities that seemed supernatural to observers, but they also sometimes destroyed them completely. The most successful clanless spiritual practitioners learned to navigate between different religious systems, adopting whatever worked for their circumstances, while maintaining enough skepticism to avoid being consumed by any single belief system. They became religious pragmatists, who were centuries ahead of their time in their ability to synthesize different spiritual traditions. These spiritual innovations eventually influenced Viking religion as a whole. Ideas about individual spiritual seeking, personal relationships with deities, and the possibility of redemption through suffering gradually entered mainstream religious thought, often without anyone recognizing their origins in the desperate experiments of social outcasts. The impact of clanless Vikings on Viking expansion and exploration was also profound but largely unrecognized. Many of the most daring voyages of discovery were undertaken by people who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from finding new lands. Established clans were often reluctant to risk their members and resources on uncertain ventures, but clanless Vikings saw exploration as their best hope for starting fresh somewhere new. These desperate explorers often served as advanced scouts for later, more organized expeditions. They mapped coastlines, identified resources, made contact with indigenous populations, and established the preliminary relationships that made formal colonization possible. Their willingness to take enormous risks provided the foundation for Viking expansion across the North Atlantic and into the Mediterranean. Some of the most famous Viking explorers and colonizers were either clanless themselves or came from families that had recently lost status and were seeking to rebuild their reputations. The drive to prove themselves worthy often pushed these individuals to achieve things that more secure people would never have attempted. The colonies they established were often more egalitarian and innovative than settlements founded by traditional clans. Without predetermined hierarchies based on family status, these communities had to develop new ways of organizing themselves and making decisions. They became laboratories for social experimentation that produced ideas and practices that eventually influenced Viking society back home. But the success of these colonies also created new forms of tragedy for clanless Vikings. Some individuals who had struggled for years to find acceptance finally achieved prosperity and status in distant lands, only to discover that their success meant nothing to the communities that had originally rejected them. They had gained everything they thought they wanted, but the psychological wounds of their earlier rejection never fully healed. Others found that success in foreign lands made them even more alien to their original culture. They returned home wealthy and accomplished, but their experiences had changed them in ways that made them incomprehensible to the people they had once desperately wanted to rejoin. They discovered that you could survive being clanless, you could even thrive, but you could never truly go back to being the person you had been before society rejected you. The children and grandchildren of successful clanless Vikings faced their own unique challenges. Born into prosperity, but aware of their family's outcast origins, they often struggled with questions of identity and belonging that were different from, but equally difficult, as those their ancestors had faced. Some tried to hide their backgrounds and integrate into established clan society. Others took pride in their outsider heritage and continued the traditions of innovation and independence that had enabled their family's survival. These generational struggles created internal conflicts within Viking communities as the descendants of outcasts began to occupy positions of wealth and influence while still being viewed with suspicion by traditional families. The social tensions this created contributed to the gradual transformation of Viking society away from rigid clan-based hierarchies toward more flexible and merit-based systems. The military implications of having large numbers of clanless Vikings were also significant, but rarely acknowledged. These individuals made excellent soldiers precisely because they had so little to lose and so much to prove. They were willing to take risks that clan-protected warriors would avoid, and their desperation often translated into extraordinary battlefield effectiveness. Smart military leaders learned to channel this desperation constructively, using clanless warriors for the most dangerous missions, while providing them with opportunities to earn respect and status through their service. Some of the most elite Viking military units were composed entirely of social outcasts who had been given a chance to redeem themselves through combat. But this military utility also made clanless Vikings dangerous to the established order. Groups of desperate, skilled warriors with nothing to lose were always potential threats to political stability. Some clanless military units eventually turned against their employers, becoming raiding bands or mercenary companies that operated entirely outside traditional social structures. The most successful of these military groups developed their own codes of honor and loyalty that were often more rigid and demanding than those of traditional clans. Having been betrayed by society once, they became fanatically devoted to the bonds they forged with their fellow outcasts. These military brotherhoods sometimes became more cohesive and effective than family-based fighting units. The economic impact of clanless Vikings extended far beyond their individual survival strategies. Their willingness to engage in trade and activities that established clans considered beneath their dignity made them essential to the functioning of Viking society, even as that society officially rejected them. They became the invisible foundation that supported the visible structure of clan-based civilization. They transported goods that respectable merchants wouldn't touch. They provided services that proper families needed, but didn't want to acknowledge. They served as intermediaries in transactions that established clans couldn't engage in directly without compromising their honor. This shadow economy became increasingly important as Viking society grew more complex and interconnected. Some clanless Vikings became so essential to these economic functions that they wielded considerable behind-the-scenes influence despite their official status as social outcasts. They controlled information flows, trade routes, and resource supplies in ways that gave them power over people who officially ranked far above them in social hierarchies. This economic influence sometimes translated into political power, as clan leaders found themselves dependent on the cooperation of people they were supposed to despise. The resulting relationships were complex and often hypocritical, with public rejection coexisting alongside private collaboration and mutual dependence. The technological innovations developed by clanless Vikings often emerged from their unique position outside traditional constraints. Without access to established methods and resources, they had to improvise, experiment, and innovate in ways that led to breakthrough discoveries and inventions. Their metalworking techniques, developed from necessity when they couldn't afford traditional tools and materials, sometimes produced superior results that were eventually adopted by established craftsmen. Their navigation methods, created to help them find their way without access to traditional knowledge, sometimes proved more accurate and reliable than conventional approaches. Most remarkably, their social innovations in governance, law, and community organization provided models for more flexible and adaptive forms of social structure that would eventually influence the evolution of Viking civilization as a whole. But perhaps the most profound impact of the clanless Viking experience was psychological and philosophical. These individuals were forced to confront fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and meaning that most people never had to face directly. Their answers to these questions, forged in the crucible of absolute social rejection, sometimes produced insights that were centuries ahead of their time. They developed concepts of individual worth that weren't dependent on family status. They created meaning systems that could survive the complete collapse of traditional social support. They learned to find purpose and dignity in circumstances that would have destroyed people who had never been tested by such extreme adversity. These psychological and philosophical innovations gradually influenced Viking culture through countless individual interactions and examples. The ideas and attitudes developed by social outcasts slowly permeated mainstream society, contributing to the gradual evolution of Viking civilization toward more individualistic and egalitarian forms. The legacy of clanless Vikings extended far beyond their own lifetimes and communities. Their innovations, discoveries, and social experiments contributed to changes that would eventually transform not just Viking society, but European civilization as a whole. They were unwitting pioneers of concepts that wouldn't be formally recognized for centuries: individual rights, social mobility, cultural pluralism, and merit-based advancement. But this legacy came at an enormous human cost that should never be forgotten or romanticized. For every clanless Viking who achieved something remarkable, there were countless others who simply suffered and died in obscurity, ground down by a system that showed them no mercy and offered them no hope. Their stories remind us that social progress often comes not from the comfortable center of society, but from its desperate margins, where people who have lost everything are forced to reimagine what human existence can be. The price of this progress was paid by individuals whose names we will never know, whose graves were never marked, whose contributions were never acknowledged by the societies they helped to transform. And yet, their influence echoes through history in ways that demonstrate the incredible resilience and creativity of the human spirit when faced with seemingly impossible circumstances. They proved that even in the most rigid and unforgiving societies, there are always possibilities for change, growth, and renewal, even if those possibilities come at a cost that seems almost too terrible to bear. The survival strategies that clanless Vikings developed were often so extreme that they bordered on the unthinkable. When you've already lost everything that Viking society considered sacred, what lines are left that you won't cross? The answer, for many, was none at all. Some turned to practices that were so taboo that even mentioning them could bring down curses upon entire communities. They became practitioners of cedar magic, the dark sorcery that proper Vikings associated with women and weaklings. They learned to commune with spirits that respectable people feared to name. They developed skills in poison making, curse weaving, and shape-shifting that made them simultaneously valuable and terrifying to anyone who knew what they could do. But here's what's truly chilling about this. They didn't choose these paths because they were evil or naturally inclined toward darkness. They chose them because they were the only paths available to people who had been cut off from all legitimate means of survival. When society declares you dead, you learn to find life in places that the living dare not go. Take the case of the clanless Vikings who became professional oath-breakers. In a society where your word was literally more valuable than your life, these individuals made their living by doing what no honorable person could do. They broke sacred vows on behalf of others. Clan leaders who found themselves trapped by impossible promises would secretly hire these social ghosts to violate the oaths in their place, transferring the spiritual contamination to people who were already considered beyond redemption. This wasn't just a clever legal loophole, it was a form of spiritual suicide that these desperate individuals undertook to earn enough to survive another day. They absorbed curses, divine displeasure, and supernatural punishment that was meant for others, knowing that it would shorten their lives and damn their souls. But when the alternative was slow starvation or violent death, even damnation became an acceptable price to pay. The psychological transformation required to survive this kind of existence was profound and often irreversible. These individuals had to develop a relationship with death and suffering that was unlike anything experienced by ordinary people. They learned to embrace pain, to find strength in degradation, to discover meaning in meaninglessness itself. Some became so comfortable with suffering that they lost the ability to experience normal human emotions. They could no longer feel joy, love, or hope in the way that healthy people did. Instead, they found a strange peace in accepting that they were living extensions of death itself, walking reminders of what happened to people who fell outside the protection of the gods and society. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming so intensely alive that they seemed to burn with supernatural energy. Having stared into the abyss of social death and chosen to keep living anyway, they developed an appreciation for existence that was almost mystical in its intensity. Every moment of survival became a victory. Every small pleasure became a treasure. Every human connection became sacred in ways that people who had never lost everything could never understand. These extreme psychological adaptations sometimes produced individuals who were capable of insights and achievements that seemed impossible for normal humans. Their proximity to death gave them perspectives on life that were simultaneously terrifying and profound. They could see through social pretensions and cultural illusions because they had experienced what lay beneath them. They could endure hardships that would break ordinary people because they had already survived worse than most people could imagine. But this came at a cost that extended far beyond their own personal suffering. The children of these individuals, when they managed to have children at all, often inherited psychological patterns that were deeply damaged. They grew up in environments where normal human relationships were impossible, where love was contaminated by desperation, where every interaction was colored by the knowledge that their parents were considered walking curses by the surrounding society. Some of these children managed to break free from the patterns of their upbringing and create healthier lives for themselves. Others became even more extreme than their parents, pushing the boundaries of what human beings could endure or achieve. Still others simply broke under the weight of their inherited trauma, becoming cautionary tales about the generational costs of social rejection. The communities that these extreme outcasts created together were unlike anything else in human history. Imagine settlements where the normal rules of human interaction had been completely abandoned. where people who had nothing left to lose experimented with ways of living that would have been unthinkable to ordinary society. These weren't just communities of criminals or outcasts in the conventional sense. They were laboratories for exploring the absolute limits of human adaptability. People who had been forced to abandon every assumption about how life should be lived found themselves free to discover what life could be when all constraints were removed. Some of these experiments produce forms of social organization that were genuinely innovative and ahead of their time. Communities where decisions were made through methods that had never been tried before, where resources were distributed according to principles that challenged every assumption about property and ownership, where relationships between men and women, parents and children, leaders and followers were redefined from the ground up. Other experiments produced results that were so disturbing that even the participants sometimes tried to forget what they had created. When people who have lost their humanity try to build new forms of human society, the results are not always pretty or admirable. Some of these communities became showcases for the darkest possibilities of human nature, places where the absence of normal constraints led to forms of cruelty and degradation that would have been impossible within traditional social structures. But here's what's remarkable. Even the most disturbing of these experiments contributed something valuable to human understanding. They pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, challenged assumptions about human nature, and demonstrated that even the most fundamental aspects of social organization were more flexible than anyone had imagined. The knowledge gained from these extreme experiments gradually filtered back into mainstream society through various channels. Former outcasts who managed to reintegrate brought insights that influenced how conventional communities dealt with crisis and change. Observers who witnessed these experiments from a distance carried stories that challenged traditional thinking about social organization and human potential. Most importantly, the very existence of these alternative communities proved that the clan system wasn't the only way to organize human society. This knowledge became a seed of doubt that gradually undermined the absolute authority of traditional structures, contributing to the slow evolution of Viking civilization toward more flexible and inclusive forms. The relationship between these extreme outcast communities and the supernatural world was particularly complex and important. Cut off from traditional religious practices and divine protection, these groups often developed entirely new approaches to spirituality that were based on direct experience rather than inherited tradition. Some became pioneers in shamanic practices that involved deliberate contact with dangerous spiritual entities. They learned to navigate realms of existence that conventional Vikings believed were too perilous for human exploration. Their spiritual experiments sometimes granted them powers that seemed genuinely supernatural to observers, but they also sometimes destroyed them in ways that served as warnings about the dangers of abandoning traditional spiritual safeguards. Others developed forms of religious practice that were remarkably modern in their emphasis on individual spiritual experience and personal relationship with the divine. Freed from the constraints of clan-based religious traditions, they could explore questions about meaning, purpose, and transcendence in ways that were impossible for people embedded within conventional spiritual frameworks. These spiritual innovations often put them into conflict with traditional religious authorities, who saw their practices as threats to established order and divine approval. But they also sometimes attracted secret followers from within mainstream society, people who were hungry for spiritual experiences that went beyond the formal rituals and inherited beliefs of conventional religion. The most successful of these spiritual innovators learned to walk a careful line between innovation and tradition, developing new practices that enhanced rather than replaced conventional religious observances. They became bridges between the old ways and new possibilities, helping to evolve Viking spirituality in directions that would have been impossible without their outsider perspectives. The impact of extreme outcast communities on Viking warfare was particularly significant, but rarely acknowledged. These groups often became sources of military innovation, precisely because they had to develop new approaches to conflict that didn't rely on traditional clan-based military structures. They pioneered forms of guerrilla warfare that were based on mobility, deception, and psychological intimidation rather than direct confrontation. They developed weapons and tactics that were designed for individuals fighting alone rather than as part of organized military units. They became experts in forms of combat that conventional warriors considered dishonorable, but which proved devastatingly effective in practice. Some of these military innovations eventually influenced mainstream Viking warfare, particularly as traditional clan-based military structures proved inadequate for dealing with new forms of conflict and changing political circumstances. The flexibility and adaptability that outcast communities had developed out of necessity became valuable assets when conventional approaches failed. But the military capabilities of these groups also made them dangerous to established authority. Communities of desperate, skilled fighters with nothing to lose were always potential sources of instability and rebellion. Some of them eventually turned their military capabilities against the society that had rejected them, becoming sources of genuine terror for conventional communities. The most successful of these military groups learned to channel their capabilities constructively, offering their services to legitimate authorities while maintaining their independence and alternative social structures. They became a kind of military elite that operated parallel to, but separate from traditional warrior classes, providing specialized capabilities that conventional forces couldn't match. The economic strategies developed by extreme outcast communities were often so innovative that they created entirely new forms of commercial activity. Cut off from traditional trade networks and clan-based economic relationships, these groups had to develop alternative approaches to creating and exchanging value. Some became pioneers in forms of commerce that were based on individual skill and innovation, rather than inherited status and family connections. They developed new products, services, and markets that had never existed before, often by identifying needs that conventional society didn't even recognize it had. Others became experts in economic activities that existed in the gaps between traditional categories of commerce. They learned to extract value from waste products that established businesses discarded, to find profit in transactions that conventional traders considered too risky or unprofitable, to create wealth from resources that others didn't even recognize as valuable. These economic innovations sometimes proved so successful that they influenced mainstream commercial practices, particularly as Viking society became more complex and interconnected. The flexibility and creativity that outcast communities had developed out of necessity became competitive advantages when conventional approaches proved inadequate for dealing with new economic challenges. But the economic success of these groups also created new forms of social tension. When people who were supposed to be social failures began accumulating wealth and influence, it challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between social status and economic success. This created conflicts that sometimes erupted into violence and always contributed to the gradual transformation of Viking economic structures. The technological innovations that emerged from extreme outcast communities were often centuries ahead of their time, precisely because these groups were free from the constraints of traditional thinking and established practices. When you have no access to conventional tools and methods, you're forced to invent new ones or die. Some of these innovations were purely practical responses to immediate survival needs. New ways of preserving food, constructing shelter, making clothing, and creating tools that could be produced with minimal resources and no access to traditional craft knowledge. These innovations were often superior to conventional approaches, precisely because they had been refined through life or death testing. Others were more fundamental breakthroughs that challenged basic assumptions about how things could or should be done. New metallurgy techniques that produced stronger materials with less fuel and labor. New navigation methods that were more accurate and reliable than traditional approaches. New agricultural practices that could produce food in environments where conventional farming was impossible. The most remarkable innovations were social technologies, new ways of organizing human cooperation, making collective decisions, and resolving conflicts that were more effective than traditional clan-based approaches. These social innovations were often the most valuable contributions that outcast communities made to human civilization, even though they were rarely recognized or acknowledged at the time. The knowledge preservation and transmission systems developed by these communities were also remarkable. Cut off from traditional methods of passing knowledge from generation to generation, they had to develop new approaches to education and cultural continuity that were often more effective than conventional methods. Some developed forms of oral tradition that could preserve complex information more accurately and completely than the formal storytelling traditions of mainstream society. Others pioneered written records and documentation systems that were more systematic and comprehensive than anything that existed within traditional clan structures. Most importantly, they developed educational approaches that were based on practical application and direct experience rather than inherited authority and formal instruction. These methods often produced individuals who were more capable and knowledgeable than people who had been educated through conventional means, even though they lacked the formal credentials and social recognition that came with traditional education. The psychological and philosophical insights that emerged from extreme outcast communities were perhaps their most profound contributions to human understanding. When people are forced to rebuild their entire understanding of life, meaning, and purpose from scratch, they sometimes discover truths that are invisible to people who have never questioned their basic assumptions about existence. These insights often centered around fundamental questions about the nature of human identity, the source of personal worth, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and social belonging. Having been forced to find meaning and purpose outside of conventional social structures, these individuals developed perspectives on these questions that were remarkably sophisticated and often anticipatory of philosophical developments that wouldn't emerge in mainstream thought for centuries. Some developed forms of individualism that were based on personal responsibility and self-determination rather than social rebellion or selfish pursuit of personal advantage. Others created concepts of community and mutual obligation that were more inclusive and flexible than traditional clan-based approaches to social organization. Most remarkably, some developed integrated worldviews that could accommodate both individual autonomy and social belonging, personal fulfillment and collective responsibility, innovation and tradition in ways that resolved conflicts that conventional thinking considered irreconcilable. These philosophical innovations gradually influenced mainstream Viking culture through various indirect channels, contributing to the slow evolution of Viking civilization toward more complex and nuanced understandings of human nature and social organization. The artistic and cultural innovations that emerged from extreme outcast communities were often the most visible expressions of their alternative approaches to life and meaning. Cut off from traditional cultural forms and artistic traditions, these groups had to develop new ways of expressing their experiences and insights. Some created entirely new forms of music, poetry, and visual art that reflected their unique perspectives and experiences. These cultural innovations were often more emotionally powerful and intellectually sophisticated than conventional artistic forms, precisely because they emerged from more intense and challenging life experiences. Others developed hybrid cultural forms that combined elements from different traditions in ways that created something entirely new. Having been forced to interact with diverse groups of outcasts and foreigners, these communities became laboratories for cultural synthesis and innovation that produced artistic forms that were centuries ahead of their time. The most successful of these cultural innovations eventually influenced mainstream Viking culture, contributing to the gradual evolution of Viking artistic and literary traditions toward more diverse and sophisticated forms of expression. But perhaps the most important cultural contribution of these communities was their development of new forms of storytelling and meaning-making that could accommodate experiences and insights that conventional cultural frameworks couldn't handle. They created new myths, legends, and narrative structures that could make sense of lives that had been lived outside the boundaries of normal human experience. These narrative innovations gradually influenced how mainstream society understood and told stories about human experience, contributing to the development of more complex and inclusive cultural traditions that could accommodate a wider range of human possibilities and achievements. The medical and healing innovations that emerged from these communities were often revolutionary precisely because they had to deal with forms of trauma and suffering that conventional healing practices couldn't address. When you're working with people who have been psychologically destroyed and physically brutalized by their experiences, traditional approaches to health and healing often prove inadequate. Some developed new approaches to treating psychological trauma that were based on direct experience rather than theoretical knowledge. They learned to help people recover from forms of emotional and spiritual damage that conventional healers didn't even recognize as treatable conditions. Others pioneered new approaches to physical healing that were based on understanding the connections between psychological and physical health. They developed treatment methods that address the whole person rather than just specific symptoms or injuries. Most importantly, they developed approaches to healing that were based on empowerment and self-determination rather than dependence on external authority. They learned to help people develop their own healing capabilities rather than simply providing temporary relief from symptoms. These medical innovations gradually influenced mainstream healing practices, particularly as conventional approaches proved inadequate for dealing with the increasing complexity and diversity of health challenges that emerged as Viking society evolved and expanded. The educational innovations that emerged from these communities were often more effective than conventional approaches, precisely because they were based on practical necessity rather than traditional authority. When you're trying to help people survive in circumstances that no one has faced before, traditional educational methods often prove useless. Some developed new approaches to skill transmission that were based on direct mentorship and hands-on experience rather than formal instruction and theoretical knowledge. These methods often produced individuals who were more capable and adaptable than people who had been educated through conventional means. Others pioneered educational approaches that were based on individual learning styles and personal interests rather than standardized curricula and uniform requirements. They learned to help people develop their unique capabilities rather than forcing them to conform to predetermined expectations. Most importantly, they developed educational philosophies that were based on the assumption that every person had valuable knowledge and capabilities to contribute, regardless of their background or social status. This was a revolutionary concept in a society that was based on inherited status and predetermined roles. These educational innovations gradually influenced mainstream approaches to learning and skill development, contributing to the evolution of Viking society toward more flexible and inclusive approaches to human development and capability building. The governance innovations that emerged from extreme outcast communities were perhaps their most politically significant contributions to human civilization. When you're trying to organize communities of people who have been rejected by conventional authority structures, traditional approaches to leadership and decision-making often prove inadequate or counterproductive. Some developed new approaches to leadership that were based on demonstrated capability and community service, rather than inherited status or traditional authority. They learned to identify and develop leaders who could be effective in circumstances that conventional leaders couldn't handle. Others pioneered new approaches to collective decision-making that were more inclusive and democratic than traditional clan-based governance structures. They developed methods for incorporating diverse perspectives and interests into community decisions without sacrificing effectiveness or accountability. Most importantly, they developed governance philosophies that were based on the assumption that legitimate authority had to be earned through service and effectiveness rather than inherited through blood relationships or traditional privilege. These governance innovations gradually influenced mainstream political developments, contributing to the evolution of Viking society toward more complex and inclusive forms of political organization that could accommodate the increasing diversity and complexity of Viking civilization. The legal innovations that emerged from these communities were often more sophisticated and effective than conventional legal systems, precisely because they had to deal with conflicts and disputes that traditional legal frameworks couldn't handle. When you're working with people who exist outside conventional social categories, traditional approaches to justice and conflict resolution often prove inadequate. Some developed new approaches to dispute resolution that were based on restoration and reconciliation rather than punishment and retribution. They learned to help people resolve conflicts in ways that strengthened rather than damaged community relationships. Others pioneered new approaches to justice that were based on understanding the underlying causes of harmful behavior rather than simply responding to its surface manifestations. They developed methods for addressing the root causes of conflict and crime that were more effective than conventional punitive approaches. Most importantly, they developed legal philosophies that were based on the assumption that every person had inherent worth and dignity regardless of their social status or past behavior. This was a revolutionary concept in a society that was based on inherited status and predetermined worth. These legal innovations gradually influenced mainstream approaches to justice and conflict resolution, contributing to the evolution of Viking legal systems toward more sophisticated and humane approaches to maintaining social order and protecting individual rights. Now, you might be thinking that I'm painting too rosy a picture of these extreme outcast communities. Let me be clear. For every innovation and breakthrough that emerged from these desperate circumstances, there were countless examples of failure, suffering, and genuine horror that should never be romanticized or forgotten. The vast majority of people who found themselves in these extreme circumstances didn't become pioneers or innovators. They simply suffered and died in ways that were brutal, meaningless, and quickly forgotten. The innovations I've been describing emerged from a tiny minority of individuals who possessed unusual combinations of intelligence, resilience, and luck that allowed them to transform their desperate circumstances into something constructive. For every person who managed to create something valuable from their outcast status, there were dozens who were broken by their experiences, who became genuinely dangerous to themselves and others, who contributed nothing positive to human civilization, and left behind only suffering and destruction. The communities I've been describing weren't utopian experiments in alternative living. They were desperate survival strategies implemented by people who had no other choices. Many of them were characterized by violence, exploitation, and forms of cruelty that were even worse than what existed in mainstream society. The innovations that emerged from these circumstances came at an enormous human cost that should never be minimized or ignored. They were purchased with suffering that was often so extreme that it challenges our ability to comprehend or empathize with the experiences of the people who endured it. But acknowledging this cost doesn't diminish the significance of what these individuals accomplished, or the importance of understanding their contributions to human civilization. If anything, it makes their achievements more remarkable and more worthy of recognition and respect. The legacy of these extreme outcast communities extended far beyond their immediate historical context. Their innovations, insights, and experiments contributed to changes in human civilization that would continue to unfold for centuries after the Viking Age had ended. Many of the concepts and practices they developed would eventually be rediscovered and formalized by later thinkers and social movements who had no knowledge of their origins in the desperate experiments of Viking Age outcasts. Ideas about individual rights, social mobility, cultural pluralism, and democratic governance that we consider fundamental to modern civilization can trace their roots back to the survival strategies developed by people who had been declared dead by their own societies. The psychological and philosophical insights they developed about human nature, personal identity, and the relationship between individual fulfillment and social belonging would eventually influence the development of modern concepts of mental health, personal development, and human potential that we take for granted today. Their innovations in governance, law, education, and social organization would contribute to the gradual evolution of human societies toward more flexible, inclusive, and effective forms of collective life that could accommodate the increasing complexity and diversity of human civilization. Most importantly, their examples prove that even in the most rigid and unforgiving circumstances, human beings retain the capacity for innovation, growth, and positive change. They demonstrated that the human spirit is capable of finding meaning, purpose, and dignity, even in situations that seem designed to destroy these possibilities completely. Their stories remind us that progress in human civilization often comes not from the comfortable center of established society, but from its desperate margins, where people who have lost everything are forced to reimagine what human existence can become. But these stories also remind us of the enormous cost of social rejection and the importance of creating societies that are inclusive enough to accommodate human diversity without forcing people into the desperate circumstances that these Viking outcasts had to endure. The clanless Vikings who managed to survive and thrive in these extreme circumstances were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who were placed in extraordinary situations and found ways to respond that revealed capabilities and possibilities that most people never have the opportunity or need to discover. Their examples suggest that all human beings possess far greater reserves of strength, creativity, and adaptability than we normally realize. The tragedy is that these capabilities are usually only revealed when people are pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. The challenge for modern societies is to find ways to nurture and develop these human capabilities without requiring people to experience the kind of extreme suffering that was necessary to reveal them in Viking Age outcasts. As we continue to grapple with questions about social inclusion, individual rights, and collective responsibility in our own time, the experiences of these long-forgotten outcasts offer insights that remain relevant and valuable. They remind us that every person has the potential to contribute something valuable to human civilization, regardless of their background, circumstances, or social status. They demonstrate that diversity and inclusion are not just moral imperatives, but practical necessities for creating societies that can adapt and thrive in changing circumstances. Most importantly, they prove that even the most marginalized and rejected members of society possess dignity, worth, and capabilities that deserve recognition and respect. The stories of clanless Vikings force us to confront uncomfortable questions about our own societies and our own treatment of people who don't fit into conventional categories or meet traditional expectations. They challenge us to consider what we might be losing when we reject or marginalize people who could potentially contribute to human flourishing if given the opportunity. They also remind us that the innovations and insights we most value in our own civilization often have their origins in the experiences of people who were considered failures, outcasts, or threats by the societies of their time. The clanless Vikings were not just historical curiosities or cautionary tales about the brutality of medieval society. They were pioneers who pushed the boundaries of human possibility and contributed to the slow evolution of civilization toward more inclusive and humane forms. Their legacy lives on in every society that values individual rights, social mobility, and cultural diversity. Their innovations continue to influence how we think about governance, education, healing, and human development. Most importantly, their examples continue to inspire people who find themselves marginalized or rejected by their own societies, proving that even the most desperate circumstances can become opportunities for growth, innovation, and positive contribution to human civilization. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from the stories of clanless Vikings is that every human being deserves the opportunity to discover and develop their unique capabilities, without having to endure the kind of extreme suffering that was necessary for these remarkable individuals to reveal their potential. The true measure of a civilized society is not how it treats its most successful and conforming members, but how it responds to those who are different, struggling, or in need of support and understanding. The clanless Vikings remind us that the people our societies are most tempted to reject or ignore may be exactly the ones who possess the insights, capabilities, and innovations that we most need for our continued growth and development as human beings. Their stories challenge us to create societies that are inclusive enough to nurture human potential without requiring people to experience social death and rebirth in order to discover what they are capable of becoming. This is the ultimate legacy of the clanless Vikings, not just the specific innovations and insights they contributed to human civilization, but the reminder that every person has the potential to contribute something valuable if given the opportunity and support they need to develop their capabilities. As we face our own challenges of social inclusion, economic inequality, and cultural diversity, the experiences of these long-forgotten outcasts offer both inspiration and guidance for creating societies that can honor the dignity and potential of every human being. The question is not whether we can afford to include and support people who don't fit conventional expectations, but whether we can afford not to, given what we might lose by rejecting the very people who could contribute most to our continued growth and development as a civilization. The clanless Vikings proved that human beings are capable of far more than most societies allow them to discover. The challenge for us is to create conditions where people can develop and contribute their capabilities without having to experience the kind of extreme adversity that was necessary for these remarkable individuals to reveal their potential. Their stories remind us that the future of human civilization depends not just on nurturing our most successful and conforming members, but on creating opportunities for everyone to discover and contribute their unique gifts to the collective human enterprise. This is the true meaning of their legacy, not just what they accomplished despite their rejection by Viking society, but what they prove is possible when human beings are pushed to discover capabilities they never knew they possessed. The clanless Vikings were not just survivors of a brutal historical period. They were pioneers of human possibility, who showed us that even the most desperate circumstances can become opportunities for growth, innovation, and positive contribution to the ongoing project of human civilization. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson we can learn from their remarkable and tragic stories. The physical toll of clanless existence was something that mainstream Viking society rarely witnessed or understood. When you're constantly on the move, never sure where your next meal will come from, always sleeping with one eye open, your body begins to break down in ways that go far beyond simple malnutrition or exhaustion. Clanless Vikings developed a distinctive appearance that marked them as outcasts even when they tried to blend in. Their skin carried the weathered look of people who had spent too many nights exposed to the elements. Their eyes held a particular kind of wariness that came from years of scanning every face for signs of recognition or threat. Their movements had a quality of coiled tension, ready to fight or flee at a moment's notice, but it was their hands that told the real story. While clan-protected Vikings might have calluses from honest work or weapon training, clanless hands bore the marks of desperate survival. Burns from handling materials that proper craftsmen would never touch. Scars from weapons that had been improvised from whatever was available. Stains from substances that respectable people wouldn't even know how to identify. These physical markers became a kind of language that clanless Vikings could read in each other instantly. A particular pattern of scars might indicate someone who had survived the slave markets of Dublin. A certain way of holding the shoulders could signal experience with the outlaw bands that operated in the deep forests. The shape of muscle development could reveal whether someone had learned to fight with conventional weapons or had been forced to master the brutal techniques of improvised combat. This physical vocabulary of survival allowed clanless Vikings to identify potential allies and threats within moments of meeting, but it also made it nearly impossible for them to successfully integrate into mainstream society even when opportunities arose. Their bodies had become permanent records of their outcast status, marking them as different in ways that couldn't be hidden or explained away. The dietary strategies that clanless Vikings developed were often so extreme that they bordered on the supernatural. When you can't rely on regular access to conventional food sources, you learn to extract nutrition from things that other people would consider inedible or even poisonous. Some became experts in foraging for plants and fungi that grew in environments too dangerous for normal people to explore. They learned to identify edible species in swamps, on cliff tops, and in the depths of ancient forests where conventional foragers feared to tread. This knowledge often included understanding of which plants could be made safe through specific preparation methods that had been developed through trial and error by generations of desperate people. Others developed techniques for preserving and processing meat from sources that respectable Vikings would never consider consuming. They learned to make jerky from animals that had died of disease, to extract usable protein from carrion that was weeks old, to prepare meals from creatures that mainstream society considered too disgusting or spiritually dangerous to eat. The most extreme developed the ability to survive on substances that weren't technically food at all. They learned to extract calories from tree bark, to find nutrients in certain types of clay, to sustain themselves on mixtures of moss and lichen that could keep them alive when nothing else was available. These dietary innovations sometimes gave clanless Vikings advantages that their better-fed counterparts lacked. Their ability to survive on minimal or unconventional food sources made them incredibly valuable as scouts, messengers, and advance parties for military expeditions. They could operate in environments where conventional forces would starve, and they could maintain their strength on rations that would leave ordinary warriors weakened and ineffective. But this nutritional flexibility came at a terrible cost. Many clanless Vikings suffered from chronic health problems related to their extreme diets. Digestive issues, vitamin deficiencies, and toxin accumulation from consuming marginal food sources left them with shortened lifespans and constant physical discomfort. More tragically, the psychological impact of being forced to eat things that violated every cultural norm about proper human behavior contributed to the sense of dehumanization that clanless Vikings struggled with. When you've been reduced to consuming substances that your culture associates with animals or the dead, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain your sense of human dignity and worth. The clothing and equipment strategies developed by clanless Vikings were masterpieces of improvisation born from absolute necessity. Without access to traditional sources of textiles, leather, and metal, they had to become experts in creating functional gear from whatever materials they could scavenge or steal. Some developed techniques for processing animal hides that had been discarded by conventional tanners as too damaged or diseased for normal use. They learned to transform materials that others considered waste into functional leather goods that were sometimes superior to conventionally produced items. Their methods often involved processes that were too time-consuming or unpleasant for established craftsmen to consider worthwhile. Others became masters of textile recycling, learning to unravel damaged cloth and reweave it into new garments. They developed techniques for combining fibers from multiple sources to create hybrid fabrics that had properties that no single material could provide. Some of these innovations produced textiles that were more durable or weather-resistant than anything available through conventional means. The most ingenious developed methods for creating metal tools and weapons from scrap materials that others had discarded. They learned to identify usable metal in the most unlikely places, to extract it using improvised furnaces and tools, and to forge it into implements that were perfectly suited to their specific needs and circumstances. These innovations in material culture sometimes attracted the attention of mainstream society in ways that were both beneficial and dangerous for their creators. Clan leaders who discovered that outcasts possessed superior gear or techniques sometimes tried to force them to reveal their secrets, leading to situations where clanless Vikings found themselves caught between the desire to trade their knowledge for acceptance and the need to protect the innovations that had kept them alive. The most successful learned to reveal just enough of their techniques to demonstrate their value without giving away the secrets that provided their competitive advantage. They became masters of partial disclosure, sharing innovations that were impressive but not revolutionary, while keeping their most important discoveries secret. The transportation methods developed by clanless Vikings were often more sophisticated than those used by conventional society, precisely because their survival often depended on their ability to move quickly and efficiently through hostile territory. Without access to established trade routes or clan-protected harbours, they had to develop alternative approaches to getting from place to place. Some became experts in overland travel through terrain that conventional travellers avoided. They learned to navigate through swamps, across mountain ranges, and through dense forests, using routes that were too dangerous or difficult for ordinary people to attempt. This knowledge made them valuable as guides for military expeditions or trading ventures that needed to reach destinations through unconventional routes. Others developed innovative approaches to water travel that didn't rely on traditional shipbuilding techniques or established harbour facilities. They learned to construct small, highly maneuverable vessels from materials that were readily available in any coastal environment. These craft were often superior to conventional boats for specific purposes like stealth operations or navigating shallow or treacherous waters. The most remarkable developed techniques for winter travel that allowed them to move efficiently across frozen landscapes when conventional transportation was impossible. They pioneered the use of improvised skis, ice sleds, and snow shelters that enabled them to operate in conditions that would stop ordinary travelers completely. These transportation innovations sometimes revolutionized conventional approaches to travel and exploration. Clanless Vikings, who had developed superior methods for covering difficult terrain, often found themselves recruited by clan leaders who needed their expertise for specific expeditions or military operations. But their knowledge also made them targets for exploitation and abuse. Once mainstream society discovered that outcasts possessed valuable transportation secrets, they often tried to extract this knowledge through coercion or deception, leading to situations where clanless Vikings found their innovations stolen and used against them. The communication systems developed by clanless Vikings were perhaps their most sophisticated innovations, born from the need to coordinate survival strategies across vast distances without access to conventional message-carrying services. These systems had to be invisible to mainstream society while remaining reliable enough to coordinate complex operations among scattered outcast communities. Some developed elaborate codes based on seemingly random arrangements of natural objects, patterns of stones, arrangements of sticks, or configurations of carved marks on trees could convey complex information about dangers, opportunities, or resource locations to people who knew how to read them. These systems were so subtle that conventional observers would see nothing more than random natural formations. Others pioneered the use of conventional activities as cover for message transmission. The way someone arranged goods in a market stall, the pattern of stitches in clothing repairs, or the sequence of songs performed by traveling entertainers could all carry coded information that was invisible to casual observers but clear to intended recipients. The most sophisticated developed networks of human messengers who could move through mainstream society without attracting suspicion. These individuals had developed cover identities and legitimate reasons for traveling that allowed them to carry information between outcast communities while appearing to be engaged in normal commercial or social activities. These communication networks sometimes became so efficient that they provided better intelligence gathering and information distribution than anything available to conventional clan-based organizations. Clanless Vikings often knew about political developments, military movements, and economic opportunities before the people who were directly involved in creating them. This information advantage sometimes translated into significant practical benefits for outcast communities. They could anticipate and avoid dangers that would catch conventional communities by surprise. They could identify and exploit opportunities before their better-positioned competitors even knew they existed. But their superior information networks also made them targets for mainstream society's suspicion and hostility. When clan leaders discovered that outcasts seemed to know things they shouldn't know, it often led to accusations of witchcraft, espionage, or supernatural assistance that could result in violent persecution. The conflict resolution methods developed within clanless communities were often more sophisticated and effective than conventional legal systems, precisely because they had to work without the backing of established authority structures. When disputes arose between people who had no recourse to traditional justice systems, they had to develop alternative approaches to maintaining order and resolving conflicts. Some communities developed elaborate systems of mediation and arbitration that were based on demonstrated wisdom and fairness, rather than inherited authority. These systems often produced more satisfactory resolutions to disputes than conventional legal proceedings, because they were focused on actually solving problems rather than simply punishing wrongdoing. Others pioneered approaches to restorative justice that emphasized healing relationships and addressing underlying causes of conflict rather than simply determining guilt and assigning punishment. These methods often proved more effective at preventing future conflicts and maintaining community harmony than punitive approaches. The most innovative developed entirely new concepts of justice that were based on the principle that everyone in the community had a stake in maintaining order and preventing harm. These systems distributed responsibility for conflict resolution among all community members rather than concentrating it in the hands of designated authorities. These innovations in justice and conflict resolution sometimes influenced mainstream legal developments, particularly when conventional systems proved inadequate for dealing with new types of disputes or changing social circumstances. But they also sometimes put outcast communities into conflict with established authorities who saw alternative justice systems as threats to their monopoly on legitimate force. The child-rearing practices developed by clanless Vikings were perhaps their most heartbreaking innovations, born from the need to prepare children for lives that would be fundamentally different from anything that conventional society could imagine. These children couldn't be raised with the expectations and assumptions that guided normal Viking child development. Clanless parents had to teach their children skills that conventional children would never need to learn. How to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a stranger was friend or foe. How to disappear quickly and quietly when danger approached. How to survive alone if their parents were killed or captured. How to extract nutrition from marginal food sources and create shelter from whatever materials were available. But they also had to provide their children with psychological tools for maintaining human dignity and worth in circumstances that were designed to destroy these qualities. They had to teach resilience without hardness, wariness without paranoia, independence without isolation. Some clanless communities developed innovative educational approaches that prepared children for lives of extreme flexibility and adaptability. These children learned multiple languages, diverse cultural practices, and a wide range of practical skills that made them capable of fitting into whatever circumstances they might encounter. Others focused on developing children's internal resources, teaching them meditation techniques, mental disciplines, and spiritual practices that could sustain them through experiences that would break people who depended entirely on external support and validation. The most successful combined practical survival skills with deep philosophical and psychological education that prepared children to find meaning and purpose in lives that would be lived outside conventional social structures. These children often grew up to become remarkable individuals who combined extraordinary practical capabilities with profound wisdom about human nature and the possibilities for human flourishing. But raising children in clanless communities also involved terrible moral compromises and psychological costs. Parents had to expose their children to dangers and hardships that would have been considered child abuse in conventional society. They had to teach them to distrust and deceive people who might otherwise help them. They had to prepare them for lives of constant vigilance and struggle. Many children raised in these circumstances suffered psychological damage that affected them throughout their lives. Others developed capabilities and insights that made them exceptional individuals, but also made it difficult for them to form normal relationships or find satisfaction in conventional ways of living. The most tragic cases involved children who were so thoroughly adapted to outcast life that they couldn't function in mainstream society, even when opportunities for integration arose. They had been shaped by their circumstances in ways that made them permanently alien to the culture their parents had originally belonged to. The mate selection and relationship formation strategies developed by clanless Vikings had to navigate challenges that were unknown to conventional society. How do you build intimate relationships when your very existence is considered dangerous by mainstream culture? How do you create families when you have no legal standing and no social protection? Some clanless individuals formed relationships within their outcast communities based on shared experience and mutual understanding of their unique circumstances. These relationships were often intensely close precisely because they were formed between people who had survived similar traumas and understood each other's struggles in ways that outsiders never could. Others sought relationships with people from mainstream society who were sympathetic to their plight, or who had their own reasons for operating outside conventional social structures. These relationships were often complicated by the power imbalances and cultural differences between people who had lived fundamentally different types of lives. The most ambitious attempted to use romantic relationships as pathways back into mainstream society, hoping that marriage or partnership with a clan-protected person might provide them with the social standing they had lost. But these strategies rarely succeeded and often resulted in tragedy for both parties involved. Clanless women face particular challenges in forming relationships because their lack of family protection made them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Some developed extraordinary skills in reading people and situations that allowed them to identify trustworthy partners and avoid dangerous ones. Others formed protective alliances with other women that provided mutual security and support. Clanless men often struggled with the psychological impact of being unable to provide the kind of protection and security that conventional masculine roles demanded. Some compensated by developing exceptional skills or accumulating wealth that could substitute for social status. Others learned to form relationships based on emotional intimacy and mutual support rather than traditional gender roles. The children born from these unconventional relationships often faced unique identity challenges. They might inherit some social protection from one parent while being marked as outcasts by their connection to the other. They had to navigate between different worlds and different sets of expectations in ways that required exceptional psychological flexibility and strength. The most successful clanless relationships were often based on principles that were ahead of their time: mutual respect, shared responsibility, emotional intimacy, and commitment that was chosen rather than socially mandated. These relationships sometimes produced exceptionally strong partnerships that could survive challenges that would destroy conventional marriages. But they also faced external pressures that conventional relationships never had to endure. The constant stress of social rejection, economic insecurity, and physical danger took tolls on even the strongest partnerships. Many clanless relationships ended not because of problems between the partners themselves, but because the circumstances of their lives made it impossible to maintain the kind of stability that intimate relationships require. The community-building strategies developed by clanless Vikings were remarkable exercises in creating social cohesion without the traditional foundations of kinship, shared history, or established authority. These communities had to be built from scratch by people who had often been traumatized by their experiences of social rejection and who had learned to distrust authority and conventional social institutions. Some communities were organized around shared survival needs, bringing together people who could provide complementary skills and resources necessary for collective survival. These were essentially mutual aid societies where everyone contributed what they could and received what they needed according to their circumstances and capabilities. Others formed around shared values or philosophical principles that provided alternative foundations for social organization. These communities were held together by common beliefs about justice, spirituality, or human nature, rather than by practical necessity or blood relationships. The most successful combined practical cooperation with emotional and spiritual support, creating environments where people who had been rejected by mainstream society could find acceptance, purpose, and meaning. These communities often developed their own rituals, traditions, and celebrations that provided the kind of cultural continuity that their members had lost when they became clanless. But building communities from scratch among traumatized and suspicious individuals was extraordinarily difficult and often unsuccessful. Many attempts at community formation failed because the people involved were too damaged by their experiences to trust each other or work together effectively. Others succeeded for a time, but collapsed when internal conflicts arose that couldn't be resolved without the kind of established authority structures and conflict resolution mechanisms that conventional communities took for granted. The most tragic cases involved communities that were destroyed by external forces just when they had begun to achieve stability and success. These losses were devastating not just because of the immediate practical consequences, but because they confirmed the worst fears of people who had already lost everything once before. The communities that did survive and thrive often became remarkable examples of human resilience and creativity. They developed forms of social organization that were more inclusive, flexible, and responsive to individual needs than conventional clan-based structures. They created cultures that celebrated diversity and innovation rather than conformity and tradition. Most importantly, they proved that human beings could create meaningful communities based on choice and mutual support, rather than accident of birth or inheritance of status. This was a revolutionary concept that would eventually influence the development of more democratic and egalitarian forms of social organization. The leadership structures that emerged in successful clanless communities were often radically different from conventional approaches to authority and governance. Without inherited positions or traditional sources of legitimacy, these communities had to develop entirely new approaches to identifying, selecting, and supporting their leaders. Some developed rotating leadership systems, where different individuals took responsibility for community decisions based on their expertise in relevant areas. This prevented the concentration of power in single individuals, while ensuring that decisions were made by people who actually understood the issues involved. Others pioneered consensus-based decision-making that required broad agreement before major community actions were taken. These systems were often slow and cumbersome, but they produced decisions that had strong community support and were more likely to be successfully implemented. The most innovative developed hybrid systems that combined elements of democratic participation with recognition of expertise and proven capability. These systems were often more effective than purely democratic or purely meritocratic approaches, because they balanced the need for broad participation with the practical requirements of effective leadership. But developing effective leadership in clanless communities was complicated by the psychological damage that many members had suffered from their experiences with authority in mainstream society. People who had been betrayed or abandoned by traditional leaders were often reluctant to trust new ones, even when those leaders had been chosen by the community itself. Many potential leaders were also reluctant to accept responsibility for others when they were still struggling to manage their own survival and recovery. The burdens of leadership were particularly heavy in communities that were constantly threatened by external dangers and internal conflicts. The most successful leaders in clanless communities were often individuals who had managed to transform their own experiences of rejection and trauma into wisdom and strength that they could share with others. They had learned to find meaning and purpose in their suffering and could help others do the same. These leaders often developed leadership styles that were more collaborative and supportive than conventional approaches. They led by example and service, rather than by command and authority. They focused on empowering others rather than controlling them. But even the most effective leaders in clanless communities faced challenges that conventional leaders never had to address. They had to maintain community cohesion without the support of established traditions and institutions. They had to make decisions without access to the kind of information and resources that conventional leaders could take for granted. Most tragically, they often had to make impossible choices between the survival of their communities and their own moral principles. The circumstances that clanless communities faced sometimes required actions that violated their deepest values about human dignity and ethical behavior. The long-term sustainability strategies developed by successful clanless communities were perhaps their most remarkable achievements, demonstrating that alternative forms of social organization could not only survive but thrive over multiple generations. These strategies had to address challenges that conventional communities never faced, while maintaining the flexibility and innovation that had enabled their initial survival. Some communities developed economic models that were based on renewable resources and sustainable practices rather than exploitation and extraction. They learned to live within their means and create value without depleting the resources that supported them. Others focused on developing human capital through education and skill development that could adapt to changing circumstances. They invested in their members' capabilities rather than in fixed assets that might become liabilities if circumstances changed. The most successful developed hybrid strategies that combined economic sustainability with cultural continuity and social cohesion. They created communities that could maintain their distinctive identities and values while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. But achieving long-term sustainability required making difficult trade-offs between competing values and priorities. Communities that focused too heavily on economic success sometimes lost the spiritual and cultural qualities that had originally attracted their members. Those that prioritized cultural preservation sometimes failed to adapt to changing economic and political circumstances. The most tragic cases involved communities that achieved remarkable success for a generation or two, but then collapsed when they failed to successfully transmit their values and practices to younger members who had not experienced the original circumstances that created the community. These failures were particularly devastating because they represented the loss not just of individual communities, but of unique experiments in human social organization that had taken decades to develop and refine. The communities that did achieve genuine long-term sustainability often became models for later social innovations that influenced the development of mainstream society. Their experiments in democratic governance, economic cooperation, and cultural diversity provided blueprints for social reforms that wouldn't be widely adopted for centuries. Most importantly, they proved that human beings were capable of creating and maintaining alternative forms of social organization that were more humane, just, and effective than conventional approaches. This knowledge became a permanent part of human cultural heritage, even when the specific communities that generated it were forgotten or destroyed. The spiritual and philosophical legacy of clanless Viking communities extended far beyond their immediate historical context, contributing to the development of ideas about human nature, social organization, and individual potential that would influence human civilization for centuries to come. Their experiments in creating meaning and purpose outside conventional social structures anticipated later developments in philosophy, psychology, and spirituality that wouldn't be formally recognized until much later periods. They developed practical wisdom about human resilience, creativity, and adaptability that remains relevant for contemporary challenges. Their innovations in governance, law, and social organization provided early examples of democratic and egalitarian principles that would eventually become foundational to modern political systems. They demonstrated that legitimate authority could be based on service and effectiveness, rather than inherited status or traditional privilege. Most importantly, their examples proved that even the most marginalized and rejected members of society possessed dignity, worth, and capabilities that could contribute to human flourishing if given the opportunity and support they needed to develop their potential. But this legacy was purchased at an enormous human cost that should never be forgotten or minimized. The suffering endured by clanless Vikings was real, immediate, and often devastating in ways that challenge our ability to fully comprehend or empathize with their experiences. Their achievements emerged not because of their suffering, but despite it. They succeeded not because social rejection was beneficial, but because human beings possess reserves of strength and creativity that can sometimes transform even the most desperate circumstances into opportunities for growth and contribution. The true lesson of their stories is not that societies should reject and marginalize people in order to stimulate innovation, but that societies should create conditions where people can develop and contribute their capabilities without having to endure the kind of extreme adversity that was necessary for these remarkable individuals to reveal their potential. Their legacy challenges us to build societies that are inclusive enough to nurture human diversity without requiring people to experience social death and rebirth in order to discover what they are capable of becoming. This is perhaps the most important gift that the clanless Vikings left to human civilization. Not just their specific innovations and insights, but the proof that every human being possesses capabilities and potential that deserve recognition, support, and opportunity for development. As we continue to grapple with questions of social inclusion, economic inequality, and human potential in our own time, their examples remind us that the people our societies are most tempted to reject or ignore may be exactly the ones who possess the insights and innovations we most need for our continued growth as a civilization. The clanless Vikings were not just survivors of a brutal historical period. They were pioneers of human possibility who showed us that even the most desperate circumstances can become foundations for remarkable achievements when human beings are willing to reimagine what life can become. And that insight remains as relevant today as it was 1,000 years ago, challenging us to create societies worthy of the full potential that exists within every human being. The winter months were when the true horror of clanless existence revealed itself in all its brutal clarity. While clan-protected Vikings gathered around their hearth fires, sharing stories and strengthening the bonds that would carry them through the dark season, the clanless faced a form of isolation that went far beyond mere physical cold. Picture this. You're huddled in whatever shelter you've managed to construct from scavenged materials, listening to the wind howling outside while knowing that just a few miles away, entire communities are celebrating the midwinter festivals that mark the turning of the year. You can almost hear the laughter, almost smell the roasted meat, almost feel the warmth of human companionship that was once as natural to you as breathing. But you might as well be imagining life on a distant star, because that world is now as unreachable as the realm of the gods themselves. The psychological impact of this seasonal isolation was devastating in ways that modern people can barely comprehend. Viking culture was built around the rhythm of communal celebration and shared hardship. The long winter nights were supposed to be times when communities came together to reinforce their bonds, to tell the stories that connected them to their ancestors, to plan for the challenges that spring would bring. Without access to these communal rituals, clanless Vikings found themselves cut off, not just from immediate human contact, but from the entire cultural framework that gave meaning to the passage of time itself. Some tried to create their own versions of these celebrations, gathering in small groups of fellow outcasts to share whatever food they had managed to accumulate and to tell whatever stories they could remember from their former lives. But these pathetic imitations of real festivities often made their isolation feel even more acute. The contrast between what they were trying to create and what they had lost was so stark that it could drive participants into depths of despair that claimed more lives than starvation or exposure. Others abandoned any attempt at maintaining connection to Viking cultural traditions and instead created entirely new approaches to marking the passage of seasons and years. They developed personal rituals that were based on their individual experiences as outcasts rather than on shared cultural memories. Some of these innovations were remarkably sophisticated, combining elements from different traditions they had encountered in their travels with insights gained from their unique perspectives on life and survival. The most successful learned to find meaning in the very isolation that tormented their less adaptable peers. They discovered that the forced solitude of winter could become an opportunity for self-reflection and personal development that was impossible for people embedded within conventional social structures. Without the constant demands and distractions of community life, they could explore aspects of their own consciousness and capabilities that they had never had the opportunity to examine. But this psychological adaptation came at a price that extended far beyond the individual. Children who grew up in these circumstances often developed relationship patterns that made it difficult for them to form healthy attachments, even with other outcasts. They learned to be so self-reliant and emotionally self-contained that they struggled to experience the kind of vulnerability and trust that intimate relationships require. The most tragic cases involved individuals who became so adapted to isolation that they lost the ability to enjoy human companionship, even when it was available. They had trained themselves so thoroughly to expect rejection and betrayal that they sabotaged their own opportunities for connection and belonging. They became prisoners of their own psychological defenses, trapped in patterns of behavior that had once been necessary for survival, but had become obstacles to any possibility of genuine human relationship. The seasonal challenges also revealed the incredible resourcefulness that desperation could inspire. Clanless Vikings developed winter survival techniques that were often superior to anything used by conventional communities. They learned to construct shelters that were more efficient and weather-resistant than traditional buildings. They developed methods for preserving food and maintaining nutrition through the lean months that kept them healthier than many clan-protected individuals. Their innovations in winter clothing and equipment were particularly remarkable. Working with scraps and cast-offs, they created layering systems and insulation techniques that provided better protection from the elements than expensive gear owned by wealthy clan members. They learned to modify and combine different materials in ways that produced results that were both functional and surprisingly elegant. Some became so skilled at winter survival that they were secretly consulted by conventional communities when harsh weather threatened to overwhelm traditional coping strategies. But these consultations had to be conducted in absolute secrecy, because acknowledging that outcasts possessed superior knowledge would have undermined the fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy that held Viking communities together. The spring thaw brought its own unique set of challenges and opportunities for clanless Vikings. After months of isolation and survival-focused existence, they had to readjust to a world where human contact became more frequent, and the possibilities for both opportunity and danger increased dramatically. For many, spring represented a chance to reinvent themselves once again. The winter had been a kind of cocoon where they could experiment with new identities and approaches to life without the scrutiny of mainstream society. When warmer weather returned and travel became easier, they could emerge as different people than they had been the previous autumn. Some used this opportunity to attempt reintegration into conventional society, hoping that their winter experiences had given them new skills or perspectives that might make them valuable enough to overcome the stigma of their outcast status. They would approach distant communities where their histories weren't known, presenting themselves as travelers or refugees rather than clanless outcasts. Others doubled down on their commitment to alternative ways of living, using their winter insights to build more sophisticated and sustainable outcast communities. They had learned what worked and what didn't during the harsh months of isolation, and they could apply this knowledge to creating better support networks and more effective survival strategies. The most ambitious used spring as a launching point for entirely new types of ventures that conventional Vikings would never have attempted. They organized expeditions to unexplored territories, established trading relationships with distant peoples, or initiated projects that required the kind of risk-taking and innovation that only people with nothing left to lose would consider. But spring also brought increased scrutiny from mainstream society as travel and trade resumed after the winter hiatus. Clanless Vikings who had managed to remain hidden during the dark months suddenly found themselves exposed to the attention of clan-protected individuals who might recognize them or become suspicious of their activities. The psychological challenges of this transition from winter isolation to spring exposure were often overwhelming. People who had adapted to solitude and self-reliance suddenly had to navigate complex social interactions while maintaining their cover identities and avoiding recognition. The stress of this constant performance often proved more difficult to manage than the physical hardships of winter survival. The most vulnerable were those who had used the winter months to develop close relationships within small, outcast communities. When spring forced them to scatter for safety or opportunity, the bonds they had formed became sources of pain rather than strength. They had to choose between maintaining relationships that might compromise their security and abandoning connections that had become essential to their emotional well-being. The summer months presented different but equally challenging circumstances for clanless Vikings. The season of raids and trade expeditions offered the greatest opportunities for both advancement and disaster. With more people traveling and more activities happening across the Viking world, there were more chances to find work, to prove oneself, or to discover new possibilities for survival and growth. But summer also meant increased competition for resources and opportunities. Clan-protected Vikings who had been relatively inactive during the winter months were now operating at full capacity, making it much more difficult for outcasts to find niches that weren't already occupied by people with better credentials and stronger support networks. The raiding season was particularly complex for clanless Vikings. On one hand, raids offered opportunities for people with nothing to lose to gain wealth and reputation through acts of exceptional courage or skill. Some clanless individuals managed to join raiding expeditions by concealing their true status, or by demonstrating capabilities that made their lack of clan protection seem irrelevant. On the other hand, raids were also times when clan loyalties were most important, and when the consequences of being discovered as an imposter were most severe. A clanless Viking who was exposed during a raid might not just lose their position, but could be killed outright or abandoned in hostile territory with no hope of rescue. The most successful clanless Vikings learned to operate in the spaces between conventional raiding activities. They became specialists in reconnaissance, in dealing with hostile populations, in managing the logistical challenges that conventional raiders preferred to avoid. They found ways to make themselves indispensable without ever fully integrating into the clan-based military structures that dominated Viking warfare. Some became professional scouts who could gather intelligence about potential targets or threats in ways that conventional forces couldn't match. Their outsider status actually became an advantage because they could move through territories and interact with populations that would be immediately hostile to obvious Viking raiders. Others specialized in post-raid activities like managing captives, disposing of goods that were too dangerous or complicated for conventional traders to handle, or negotiating with local populations who had been affected by raiding activities. These roles were essential to the success of raiding expeditions, but they were often considered too dishonorable or risky for clan-protected Vikings to undertake directly. The trading season also offered unique opportunities and challenges for clanless Vikings. Their desperation and flexibility often made them willing to engage in forms of commerce that conventional traders avoided, but their lack of clan protection made them vulnerable to exploitation and cheating by more established merchants. Some carved out niches in dangerous or marginal trading activities that offered high profits for those willing to accept extreme risks. They became specialists in transporting goods through hostile territories, in dealing with populations that conventional traders couldn't or wouldn't approach, or in handling commodities that were too volatile or controversial for mainstream commerce. Others developed innovative approaches to trade that didn't rely on traditional clan-based networks of trust and credit. They pioneered forms of commerce that were based on immediate exchange, on personal relationships rather than family connections, or on new forms of value assessment that conventional traders hadn't considered. The most successful clanless traders often became pioneers in opening new markets and trade routes that conventional merchants were too conservative or risk-averse to explore. Their willingness to venture into unknown territories and deal with unfamiliar peoples sometimes led to the discovery of valuable new sources of goods or profitable new trading relationships. But their success also made them targets for exploitation by more established traders who wanted to benefit from their discoveries without acknowledging their contributions or sharing the profits fairly. Many clanless Vikings who had risked everything to develop new trading opportunities found their innovations stolen by clan-protected merchants who had the political connections and financial resources to formalize relationships that the outcasts had initiated. The autumn harvest season brought its own unique challenges and opportunities for clanless Vikings. This was the time when conventional communities were focused on gathering and preserving the resources that would sustain them through the coming winter, creating both opportunities for work and increased competition for essential supplies. Some clanless Vikings had developed agricultural skills during their outcast years that made them valuable as seasonal laborers during harvest time. They could offer their services to communities that needed extra hands without necessarily revealing their true status. This provided them with opportunities to earn food and supplies for the winter, while also allowing them to observe and potentially integrate into communities that might offer longer-term possibilities. Others used the harvest season as an opportunity to gather their own winter supplies through foraging, hunting, and small-scale agriculture in marginal areas that conventional communities didn't consider worth exploiting. They had learned to identify and utilize resources that others overlooked, allowing them to accumulate winter stores without competing directly with clan-protected populations. The most ambitious used autumn as a time to finalize preparations for winter projects that would occupy them during the dark months ahead. They might spend the harvest season gathering materials for craft projects that could be completed during winter isolation, or establishing relationships and agreements that would provide them with opportunities when spring returned. But autumn also meant facing the approaching winter with all its challenges and uncertainties. Clanless Vikings had to make difficult decisions about where to spend the dark months, who to trust with their survival, and what risks to accept in order to secure the resources they would need to make it through to another spring. The psychological pressure of these decisions was often overwhelming. Unlike clan-protected Vikings who could rely on established community support systems, outcasts had to take personal responsibility for every aspect of their winter survival. A single mistake in judgment could mean death, and there was no one else to blame if things went wrong. The most tragic cases involved individuals who had managed to survive multiple winters as outcasts, but who finally succumbed to despair when faced with the prospect of enduring yet another season of isolation and hardship. They had reached the limits of their psychological resilience and could no longer find the motivation to continue fighting for survival. Others found renewed strength in the very repetition of the seasonal cycle. Each winter they survived proved to themselves and others that they possessed capabilities that even they hadn't fully recognized. The annual cycle of challenge and survival became a source of pride and identity that sustained them through difficulties that would have broken people who hadn't been tested by such extreme circumstances. The long-term effects of living through multiple seasonal cycles as a clanless Viking created psychological patterns that were both remarkably resilient and deeply damaged. These individuals developed an acute awareness of the passage of time and the changing nature of circumstances that gave them advantages in planning and adaptation that conventional Vikings often lacked. They learned to think in longer time horizons, while also being prepared to adapt instantly to changing circumstances. They could make plans that extended across multiple seasons, while remaining flexible enough to abandon those plans completely if conditions required it. This combination of long-term thinking and tactical flexibility made them formidable opponents and valuable allies for anyone wise enough to recognize their capabilities. But these same adaptive capabilities often made it difficult for them to form stable relationships or commit to long-term goals that required consistency and predictability. They had learned to change so readily that they sometimes lost track of their own core values and desires. They became so good at adapting to circumstances that they forgot how to shape circumstances to meet their own needs and preferences. The seasonal experiences of clanless Vikings also created unique forms of cultural knowledge that were passed down through informal networks of outcasts and eventually influenced broader Viking society. Their innovations in survival techniques, their insights into human psychology under extreme stress, and their experiments in alternative forms of social organization became part of the hidden curriculum that helped Viking civilization adapt to changing conditions and challenges. These contributions were rarely acknowledged or formally recognized, but they formed an invisible foundation that supported many of the more visible achievements of Viking culture. The flexibility, resilience, and innovation that characterized Viking expansion and adaptation were partly products of knowledge and techniques that had been developed by social outcasts who had no choice but to push the boundaries of what was considered possible. The seasonal cycle of clanless existence also created forms of temporal consciousness that were different from conventional Viking approaches to time and meaning. While clan-protected Vikings organized their lives around traditional festivals and communal celebrations that connected them to ancestral traditions and social obligations, outcasts had to create their own relationships with the passage of time. Some developed highly personal and idiosyncratic approaches to marking significant moments and transitions. They created private rituals and observances that were based on their individual experiences rather than shared cultural traditions. These personal approaches to sacred time often proved more meaningful and psychologically sustaining than conventional religious observances because they were directly connected to the individual's actual life experiences and spiritual insights. Others abandoned conventional approaches to temporal meaning entirely and developed relationships with time that were based on immediate experience rather than historical connection or future planning. They learned to find significance in the present moment that was independent of its relationship to past or future events. This temporal consciousness was often remarkably sophisticated and anticipatory of philosophical and spiritual developments that wouldn't be widely recognized for centuries. The most successful clanless Vikings learned to combine multiple approaches to temporal meaning, maintaining awareness of conventional seasonal cycles while also developing personal relationships with time that sustained them through experiences that conventional cultural frameworks couldn't accommodate. These innovations in temporal consciousness gradually influenced broader Viking culture through various indirect channels, contributing to the development of more complex and flexible approaches to sacred time and seasonal meaning that enriched Viking spiritual and cultural traditions. The cumulative impact of multiple seasonal cycles on clanless Viking communities was often transformative in ways that created genuinely new forms of human social organization. Communities that survived multiple years of seasonal challenges developed institutional knowledge and cultural practices that were unlike anything that existed in mainstream Viking society. These communities learned to balance the need for seasonal adaptation with the requirement for cultural continuity across time. They developed traditions and practices that could be maintained through changing circumstances while also remaining flexible enough to evolve in response to new challenges and opportunities. The most successful created hybrid cultural forms that combined elements from mainstream Viking tradition with innovations that had emerged from their unique experiences as outcasts. These hybrid cultures were often more resilient and adaptable than conventional Viking communities because they had been tested by extreme circumstances and refined through multiple cycles of challenge and adaptation. But they were also more fragile in some ways because they lacked the deep historical roots and broad social support that sustained conventional communities through periods of crisis and change. When these alternative communities faced overwhelming challenges, they often had fewer resources and backup systems to fall back on than more traditional communities. The legacy of these seasonal adaptations extended far beyond the immediate survival of the communities that created them. The knowledge, techniques, and cultural innovations that emerged from clanless seasonal experiences became part of the broader pool of human wisdom about adaptation, survival, and community building that would influence human civilization long after the specific circumstances that created them had disappeared. Their examples proved that human beings were capable of creating meaningful and sustainable ways of life, even under the most challenging circumstances. They demonstrated that culture and community could be rebuilt from scratch when necessary, and that innovation and tradition could be combined in ways that produced results that were superior to either alone. Most importantly, they showed that the human capacity for adaptation and growth was far greater than most people realized, and that even the most marginalized and rejected members of society possessed capabilities that could contribute to human flourishing if given the opportunity to develop and express them. The seasonal experiences of clanless Vikings remain relevant today as examples of human resilience and creativity under extreme circumstances. Their stories remind us that every person possesses reserves of strength and capability that are rarely fully utilized, and that societies are strongest when they find ways to nurture and develop the potential that exists within all their members, including those who don't fit conventional expectations or categories. As we face our own seasonal cycles of challenge and opportunity, the examples of these long-forgotten outcasts offer insights into how human beings can adapt, survive, and thrive even when circumstances seem designed to destroy them. Their legacy lives on in every person who refuses to accept defeat, who finds ways to create meaning from suffering, and who discovers possibilities for growth and contribution even in the most unlikely circumstances. The clanless Vikings were not just survivors of historical hardship. They were pioneers of human possibility who proved that even the most desperate circumstances could become foundations for remarkable achievements when human beings were willing to reimagine what life could become. And that lesson remains as powerful today as it was 1,000 years ago, challenging us to recognize and nurture the potential that exists within every human being, regardless of their circumstances or social status. The harsh reality is that being a clanless Viking wasn't just about surviving physical hardships or social rejection. It was about facing the ultimate test of what it means to be human when everything that defines humanity has been stripped away from you. Think about this for a moment. When you lose your clan, you don't just lose your family or your social standing. You lose your very identity as a person. You become what the Vikings called a shadow walker, someone who exists between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. You're technically alive, but you're no longer considered truly human by the society around you. The most heartbreaking part of this entire story is that it could happen to anyone, at any time, for reasons that were often completely beyond their control. A plague could wipe out your entire family line overnight. A blood feud could eliminate everyone who shared your name. A simple accusation of cowardice or oath-breaking could transform you from a respected warrior into a social ghost in the space of a single conversation. And once you crossed that line, there was almost no way back. The stigma of being clanless was so powerful that even extraordinary achievements rarely restored your standing. You could save entire communities from destruction, discover new lands, or accumulate vast wealth, but you would still be marked as someone who existed outside the natural order of things. The psychological toll of this permanent exclusion created forms of trauma that we're only beginning to understand today. These weren't just people dealing with temporary setbacks or difficult circumstances. They were human beings who had been declared non-existent by their own culture, forced to rebuild their entire sense of self from nothing. Some never recovered from this psychological devastation. They became the walking wounded, shuffling through life without hope or purpose, waiting for death to finally claim them officially. Others transformed their pain into a fierce determination to prove their worth, becoming some of the most innovative and accomplished individuals of their time. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the clanless Vikings was how they ultimately changed the very society that had rejected them. Their innovations in trade, exploration, warfare, and social organization gradually influenced mainstream Viking culture in ways that most people never recognized or acknowledged. They proved that human potential isn't determined by social status or family connections. They demonstrated that innovation often comes from the margins, from people who have been forced to think differently because conventional approaches weren't available to them. They showed that resilience and creativity can emerge from even the most devastating circumstances. Their legacy lives on today in every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has been rejected by the groups they thought would accept them, who has had to rebuild their life from scratch after losing everything they thought defined them. The clanless Vikings remind us that being human isn't about fitting into predetermined categories or meeting other people's expectations. It's about finding ways to create meaning, purpose, and dignity, even when the world seems determined to deny you these basic human needs. They teach us that every person has inherent worth that doesn't depend on external validation or social recognition. They show us that even the most marginalized individuals possess capabilities and insights that can contribute to human progress and understanding. Most importantly, they prove that no matter how completely you might be rejected by society, you still have the power to choose how you respond to that rejection. You can let it destroy you, or you can use it as the foundation for building something entirely new and potentially extraordinary. The story of what it sucked to be a Viking without a clan is ultimately a story about the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the endless possibilities that emerge when people refuse to accept that their circumstances define their destiny. These forgotten outcasts didn't just survive one of history's most brutal forms of social rejection, they transformed it into something that enriched human civilization in ways that are still being discovered today. And that might be the most important lesson of all, that every person, no matter how rejected or marginalized they might seem, carries within them the potential to contribute something valuable to the ongoing story of human achievement and understanding.